Ready to go!
Alrighty YouTube, welcome to another video. I'm going to talk about fundamentals versus non-fundamentals in arm wrestling today. A topic that has been bubbling up in my mind since the side pressure video and the side pressure talk that has been happening in the last sort of 24-48 hours. I went live with Neil Pickup and the Fix crew this morning. We had special guests Rob Vigent Jr. and Jerry Carteret, two very polarizing style arm wrestlers, and the debate raged pretty intensely about side pressure, the use of side pressure, the application of training in side pressure, the risks involved, all that sort of stuff. And I wanted to kind of clarify and give you my perspective on what I consider fundamental arm wrestling versus non-fundamental arm wrestling, and how and when and why you would choose to employ fundamental or non-fundamental arm wrestling. So first of all, let's give the definition of what each style of arm wrestling is. Fundamental arm wrestling is what I consider things like wrist flexion, pronation, back pressure, and let's call it side pressure with the use of things like your pec. Okay. Fundamental arm wrestling, for me, is really defined by the use of concentric musculature contractions being superior to your opponent's fundamental strengths as well. So, having great wrist flexion gives you control. Having great back pressure brings the match to your side of the table, usually gets your opponent holding onto you. Having great pronation attacks your opponent's wrist. And then having great strong pecs wins you center, which exposes or weakens and disables the potential of your opponent further. Non-fundamental arm wrestling, I really consider to be defined by kind of the theory of finding a way when there isn't a way using fundamentals. And tendon strength, joint locks, angling of bones, angling of tissue in such a way, or repositioning of elbows to create geometrical problems for a fundamental arm wrestler. To create not concentric movements that are contracting more superior to your opponent, but creating a wall of, like I said, geometry plus tendons plus bones to ultimately defeat your opponent. Now, that for me is fundamental and non-fundamental. Now, which one should you do? Okay. Which one should you do is really defined by who you are as an arm wrestler. And when I say who you are, I'm talking specifically about the biomechanics of your body. And it's always in respect or in relation to your opponent. For example, Rob Vigent Jr., man I'm talking about a lot at the moment, who we debated with this morning. He has a very large hand, he has very large biceps, and the length of his arm is reasonably long. So for me, and again, using myself as an example, for me to approach a match with Rob, it would be very unwise for me to attempt to take him on using fundamental arm wrestling. Simply because my hand is smaller, my bicep strength is not as significant, and my elbow to fingertip might be a touch shorter than his. Now, the reason I would never choose to use fundamental arm wrestling against an opponent like that is simply it's an uphill battle that even if I was stronger in those fundamentals, because of the size of the hand, the length of the arm, it's an uphill battle and it's not going to help. So you have to understand where you are in the sport in terms of the opponent you're taking on. Now, if I was to take on a different arm wrestler, if I was to take on Todd Hutchins, who has a 2-inch shorter elbow to fingertip than I have, who has, I think, about the same sized hand as me, and whose bicep strength is similar-ish to mine, then I would actually be better off suited actually pulling him using fundamentals. Because to use non-fundamentals against someone with that shape and size would be an uphill battle. So again, it's understanding where you are in the sport biomechanically as to how and why you choose at any given moment in a match to pull using either fundamentals or non-fundamentals. Now, to expand further on the non-fundamental side of things, risk. Yes, there is risk involved in pulling non-fundamentals. More risk in pulling in a non-fundamental manner than there is fundamentals. And that's because you're asking your body to be resilient in ways that it's just really kind of not designed to. At the end of the day, fundamental arm wrestling keeps your body in a linear sort of direction. Everything's moving the way muscles and joints are meant to move. As soon as you ask your body to do something non-fundamental, there is an increased risk. And a lot of people aren't conditioned to it. It is something that we, as professional arm wrestlers, will largely push you away from if you're a novice and an amateur. It's something that you need to gradually build up. It's something that you need to have a very, very sound understanding of your own connective tissue limits. And more importantly, you need to know how not to overexpose it. Okay, if you commit to non-fundamental arm wrestling and you don't have the table sense, the table IQ, and the awareness of your own connective tissue in respect to the finishing power of your opponent, you are at a very high risk of breaking your arm or tearing a tendon. So don't do it if you're a novice. Don't do it if you're an amateur. Be patient with it. Focus on fundamentals first. And slowly, at low and safe pressures, build up to using non-fundamental arm wrestling. That really is a must. And it just, doing it any other way, I want to really make it clear, doing it any other way is a big risk if you are not adept to it. Now, having said all that, I'm a fan of non-fundamental arm wrestling. It's actually become my ace. I started off as a fundamental based arm wrestler, and I became, now I believe, a non-fundamental based arm wrestler as my biggest weapon. And there's one more question that I wanted to answer that I've seen people prompt me with, and it's an important question to answer. And it's, do you deliberately dive into a non-fundamental position from the go? And the answer is no. Okay, even though I believe non-fundamental arm wrestling is my ace, I use every single ounce of my fundamental strengths first in every match. I will never let my hand go, let my rotation go, let my back pressure go, just to establish a tendon, elbow-based and shoulder-based block. Doing so exposes it too much and doesn't actually help you win the arm wrestle because it doesn't put any work on your opponent. When I go into a side pressure, elbow-based, shoulder-based blocking position, okay, there's a few other critical, and when I say critical, I mean really critical, strengths and control points that you need to establish for the match. For me, the most critical control point is I need to get control of my opponent's pronator. Now, if my opponent's pronator, and by pronation I'm just talking about this, if my opponent is hitting, whether they're in the hook or whether they're top rolling, if my opponent's pronator is compromised, i.e. if I've taken control of their pronator, which is done with primarily fingers and back pressure, be it through my lats or my bicep, either version, which is going to just depend on what my opponent's doing, which one I use. Fingers, for me, are the most critical thing when in the straps in particular to defeat somebody's pronator. Now, if their pronator is defeated straight away, they don't really have they've been significantly reduced in their fundamental finishing power. They could, of course, choose to use non-fundamentals, but we're going to talk about an opponent who's just staying in fundamentals. The Rob Vincent types, the John Brzenk types, the Lachlan Adair types, the fundamental arm wrestlers, Sam Burnett types. There's no shortage of fundamental arm wrestlers. Now, if their pronator is collapsed, what that means is that they can only use their pronator to the center. Anything beyond center, their pronator gets left behind. So they're still going to have a defense. If they're a talented defensive arm wrestler, you can expect their pronation to be still there and engaged. But everything from center, they will no longer have pronation as part of them. So you've really put the brakes on them there. So the first thing that I always look for when I'm entering a match is I'm trying to win with fundamentals. I'm trying to force my hook, and if my opponent takes my wrist, my fingers, even though my wrist has gone back, my fingers will still remain in control of their pronator. And it might not be till 45 degrees down or even just a moments above the pin line that I finally get control of their pronator. Now, at that point, when I'm finally in control of their pronator, they can no longer move towards victory without leaving it behind. And I add then my shoulder and my elbow. Prior to that moment, I was not committing my shoulder and elbow. I was not just diving. Diving in is risky, really risky, because you cannot really get a good grip on how much inertia there is in that opening drive from your opponent. So get control of the damn pronator first. Priority number one. That's the way I do it. You can get control of their wrist flexion. That could be your way of establishing a safe zone to initiate with the non-fundamentals. But for me, get control of their pronator first. As soon as you've got control of their pronator, then for me, within myself, my experience of my elbow and shoulder conditioning, I know it's safe to go bang once I've got them in, because their side pressure potential has been significantly chopped. They have great defensive power still, they have great back pressure still, but that's not going to hurt me. That's not going to break my arm, and that's not going to bust my tendon. So pronator collapsed, side pressure engaged using non-fundamental elbow-based, tendon-based elbows and shoulder lock position. I'm using geometry, I'm using bone angle, I'm using all those nasty, nasty, nasty things that scare people. Now, from there, it's not an active movement. We're not going to concentrically squeeze anything unless we have to defend. What we're going to do from there is we've created a wall, a static, unbreakable wall, ideally, and we're going to hip flexion. We're going to bend at our hips to actually start to move the match towards victory. We're not going to, very rarely in this style would I start to tricep press actively. That will come right at the end once I've won shoulder line. Then I might go for a fundamental tricep press. But at this stage, it is very much non-fundamental, create a wall, got control of their pronator, and that's it. Patience there. Sometimes you can't pull through, sometimes you can. Normally, it's maintain that static position whilst your opponent's fundamentals run out of energy, gas out to a degree. You sense that they've gassed out enough, then the hip flexion starts to come through. You drive through, take center using hip flexion and maintaining control of the pronator, maintaining the defensive block. And then once they are exposed in a fundamental sense, you can either just go all the way to the pad with the hip flexion, or you can return to fundamental arm wrestling and top roll press. You can shoulder roll, finish it however you want. Yeah. All right. I think that's it. I think that's kind of the points I wanted to get across. I wanted to say that the debate about this that I had with Rob, that I had with Neil, that I had with a lot of the internet last 24 hours, I think everyone was looking at it far too simply, thinking that there was simply just an elbow and an active exposure of that and no appreciation for the other things that need to happen in order to make that the case. It really is as I just described it. For me, okay? Everyone's a different arm wrestler. But like I said, whether you choose to use fundamental or non-fundamental arm wrestling is going to come down to who you are and who your opponent is. At the end of the day, if two arm wrestlers try to use fundamental arm wrestling, i.e. wrist flexion, pronation, back pressure, center with muscles, one of you is going to win or it's going to be dead even. If it's dead even, expect one of you to gas out and lose. Like the gas, it will overwhelm one of you. But the other option, like I said, is if the fundamentals are even and you're not sure who's going to be superior, the person who adds or makes the decision to change to non-fundamental arm wrestling first will be connected to their side pressure, and the opponent won't be. So it's a component of the sport. You have to acknowledge it. It is a real component of the sport. There have been many world champions that utilize that as their ace. Less than there are than the fundamentals. I think there are more fundamental-based world champions than non-fundamental, but it's a part of the sport. And to think that to try to say anything else other than that it's a part of the sport and that it can be used as a major weapon is simply ignorance. It's just ignorance to say that it's not the case. If you have a big hand, big biceps, fundamental arm wrestling is going to lend itself very well to you until you meet someone with a bigger hand and a bigger bicep. And then fundamental arm wrestling is going to suck for you all of a sudden. So understanding that the sport is complex is a great way to begin. Really study the biomechanics. Really ask yourself what's available. What weapons do I have? Is my hand big, small, wrist big, small, arm long or short? There's an advantage there somewhere, trust me. You've just got to think about it, identify it, and then learn how to apply it against all of the different styles of arm wrestlers that you'll ever face. All right, guys, I'm gonna leave it there. Hope you guys are well. Tag someone for me in this video that doesn't believe in side pressure, that thinks it's too dangerous, because this is an important lesson for them to learn. It is too dangerous if done wrong. And like I said, if you're a novice, please do not go blindly jumping into this position. You will probably break your arm. Understand what you're doing first. Build the conditioning steadily and slowly, and really study what the hell it is you're doing before you go red line. All right, guys, take care.
Yes, that's a man!